Asian countries, they had a similar skills situation and education situation than we have, but they created jobs for the skills that they had and not the skills that they wish they had. And I was reading the biography of Lee Kuan Yew, and he says that the first initially met a businessman who had an idea when he started after Singapore's independence. And this businessman, he just said, listen, I want something that's going to create jobs. And the first business they started was to make fish hooks. So you start where the people are and you change the structure of the economy to create the jobs that are appropriate for the profile of your unemployed people. And you talked about textiles. In those countries, they also did labor-intensive textile industries, which became exporters. I was reading recently, Bangladesh is successfully doing that now. So what happens in those countries, as you move and you start educating your population, you move away from those labor-intensive industries and you move up the value chain, and then it moves on to countries like Bangladesh. Yeah. I just think we have to come up with a proper plan. We can achieve 100% renewable, I think, in about 10 years, if we were serious about it. We can create many jobs through this decarbonization situation in our economy. There's so many things that we can do to grow our economy and create the jobs. I believe we also need to have universal public services. We have to expand the care economy. We have to create free education, free healthcare, and we must equalize our two healthcare systems. According to my calculations, the shortages in terms of nurses, doctors, whatever, if we are to create the appropriate ratios between doctors and population and nurses and population, I think our shortfalls are about 400,000. So we have to expand public services significantly. And then we have to have mass housing, mass transport. So these are some of the things that I think that we can do. There's so many ideas that we can do. But in the meantime, I have to say, we have to have some way of addressing the immediate humanitarian crisis. And I'm a big advocate of the basic income grant that we should be implementing for the people between ages of 18 and 59, because it will take a while for us to create jobs for every single South African.
How do we pay for all this, Duma? When such issues are brought up, you often hear that question that we already have this small tax base in South Africa. So how do we pay for it?
Last year during the crisis, countries spent 16 trillion rands on stimulus packages. That was 17% of global GDP. Every single country that implemented a stimulus could not afford it, number one. I look at Brazil, which had a higher debt to GDP ratio than South Africa, which implemented a much more vigorous stimulus for their economy. And what happened there in many of these countries is that the central banks of these countries, in the rich countries, they financed the stimulus packages. The central bank money creation was about 15% of GDP. I've just done a paper for Naledi, the think tank of COSATU, for the public sector wage bill, and I came up with 11 options of how we can finance the stimulus that I'm talking about. Number one, the central bank, if we had a proper one, can create the money at no cost. They can print the money. That is number one. And number two, the central bank can be involved in what is called quantitative easing, where they buy government bonds on the bond market. Number three, they can be provided with, the central bank can lend money directly to companies and the government. We see it with the Bank of England. They provided loans to companies that were in trouble. They provided loans to football clubs. Arsenal and Tottenham Hotspurs took loans from the Bank of England. The US, they provided loans to municipalities, to local government. In China, the People's Bank of China provided loans to hospitals. So we need to change this monetary policy framework. We have to have a central bank that is geared towards economic development and job creation. So job creation must be part of this mandate of the central bank, because the central bank can be involved in creating the jobs. The second issue I want to say is that if you look at fiscal policy, our debt to GDP ratio is 80.3%. That is not high by international standards, because every single country after the coronavirus had a similar hit to their GDP as as we did. The world average debt to GDP ratio is about 100%, and in rich countries, it's about 120%. So our debt is not high by international standards. We can borrow more money. And the other thing I want to say is that in the budget, we have got about 292 billion rands cash in terms of government's bank account. Some of that can be released into the economy. We also have foreign exchange reserves of 800 billion rands. We do not need so much foreign exchange reserves. I calculate that we can release about half of those foreign exchange reserves into the economy, 400 billion rands. And then our public investment corporation is overfunded. It's got assets of about 2.2 trillion. And I made certain recommendations as to how we can reduce the funding of the PIC and release money into the economy. There are many things that we can do as a country. Basically, what people need to understand is that government's budget does not operate like a household budget, because if the government spends money into the economy, it gets the money back. If the government spends R1 billion, they get 150 million rands from that, and they create jobs and people pay tax from those jobs. So people must understand they mustn't make these analogies between the household debt and the government debt. The International Monetary Fund calculated that when the government spends $1 on infrastructure, it grows the economy by $2.7. That is what I'm trying to say, is that I think the problem we make is we make these analogies with our household or company budget.